The warm sunlight filtered through the tree branches in the park, creating a peaceful and elegant atmosphere in the heart of the city. The sound of laughter and chatter from the patrons, the clinking of spoons against bowls, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee blended in the air like a perfect painting of wealth. A small cafe, nestled quietly on the edge of the park, was a favorite spot for the elite. They sat enjoying their lunch in complete relaxation, completely unaware of a boy standing hidden outside. That boy, James Carter, stood among the crowd, his eyes fixed on the table where an elderly man sat, his hand brushing over his phone. He could hear the murmurs of conversation, but his heart was focused on a bowl of pristine white soup, steaming gently. It was the only dish he hadn't had the chance to enjoy for months. But today something felt off. The woman sitting across from him, Jessica Thornton, casually reached into her bag and pulled out a small vial. Her movement was natural, but James, with the sharp eyes of a child who had lived in the shadows of life, couldn't help but notice. A strange drop fell into the soup, and then she stirred it gently, as if nothing had happened. James's heart raced, and his breath grew heavier. What should he do? Should he stay silent? But if he stayed quiet, would the man at the table pay the price with his life? A sense of rightness surged within James. He couldn't just stand there. He couldn't stay still knowing something wrong was about to happen. He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, without hesitation, he shouted, "Don't eat that!" In the cafe, usually the place for the wealthy to savor every moment of tranquility, suddenly descended into a tense atmosphere that only James could feel. He stood silently, his eyes never leaving the dining table of Victor West, a famous billionaire who was enjoying lunch with his wife, Jessica Thornton. The scent of the steaming hot soup wafted from the pristine white bowl, and though James was hungry, he couldn't tear his eyes away from one strange detail. When Jessica took a small vial out of her purse, her expression remained eerily calm. But the light, reflecting off the glass vial in her hand, made it impossible for James to ignore. He was certain it wasn't some seasoning, but something dangerous, being poured into Victor's meal. Just one small drop, and everything could end in a tragedy. He didn't know exactly what the substance was, but his instincts told him it was not something anyone should be adding to a bowl of soup. Jessica glanced around once, and then, with practiced ease, she poured the liquid into Victor's bowl without a moment's hesitation. The feeling in James' chest tightened like a vice. He took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. But then fear overwhelmed him, and he couldn't stand by and watch any longer. James's heart raced wildly in his chest as conflicting thoughts churned in his mind. If I don't do something, will this man die without anyone knowing? Questions like these spiraled endlessly in his head. He was just a homeless child, someone whom the world had forgotten. People around him would likely think he was just a kid craving attention. But James knew, deep down, that this was the truth, a truth that couldn't be ignored. He looked up to see Victor still absorbed in his phone, completely unaware that he was about to fall victim to a cruel plot. Jessica sat there with a graceful expression, yet her eyes never left the soup bowl, as if everything unfolding was part of her plan. She would not stop. James took a deep breath, swallowing the rising fear in his chest. He couldn't let this happen. What could a street kid like him do? He could stop it with just one word. He thought about everything he had been through, the countless nights without shelter. We all have the right to live, no matter who we are. He stepped out of the shadows, his feet moving as though an invisible force pushed him toward Victor's table. Eyes from all around stopped, watching him. But James no longer felt afraid. He sensed something greater than himself, guiding him forward. As James approached the table, he could feel the shift in the air. Every eye in the cafe was now fixed on him. Victor, lifting his gaze from his phone, maintained his usual calm expression, but the presence of James made him pause and look directly at the boy. James felt his heart tighten, but Victor's eyes betrayed no sign of panic. "Don't eat that!" James shouted, his voice trembling yet resolute. He couldn't let this moment slip away. Everything seemed to freeze. The sounds in the cafe disappeared, leaving only the echo of the warning that reverberated through the quiet space. Victor, surprised, stopped his hand mid-motion, the spoon now just inches from his mouth. Jessica, without missing a beat, whipped around, her face hardening into a cold glare, her eyes burning into James. "What did you say?" she snapped, her tone sharp as a blade. Her words carried not only anger, but an underlying threat. James didn't flinch, his gaze tracking Jessica's every move. He didn't look at Victor anymore. He just needed to speak the truth. "She put something in your soup. I saw it." The atmosphere in the cafe began to shift. The low murmurs that had filled the room earlier fell silent, and the curious stares of the other patrons turned to James. Whispers spread, and the scrutiny intensified. But Jessica, still trying to maintain her icy composure, snapped back. "You're lying!" However, the determination in James's eyes made Victor uneasy. He couldn't ignore the words, even if they came from a child with nothing to lose but his courage. "James, right?" Victor finally spoke, his voice softer now, tinged with suspicion. "What are you saying she did?" James didn't hesitate. He recounted every detail he had witnessed. She took a small bottle from her purse, poured it into the soup, and stirred it. He met Victor's gaze squarely and added, "If you don't believe me, you can have someone check." For a moment, everything was still. The weight of James's words hung in the air, as if the cafe had collectively held its breath, waiting for the next move. Victor sat up straight, his hand still gripping the spoon, but now unable to bring it to his mouth. A wave of doubt surged within him. Jessica, the wife he trusted, was the only one sitting beside him now. But a homeless child, whose name no one knew, had pointed out the truth that he had never even suspected. What was happening? Victor's gaze shifted from James to Jessica, and then back to James, as if searching for the truth in the boy's eyes. A long silence hung in the air, and in that stifling moment, Jessica suddenly forced a smile, trying to regain her composure. "He's just a worthless child. Don't listen to him," Jessica spat with contempt, trying to dismiss the doubt in Victor's eyes. She couldn't let this be exposed. But James, unshaken, stood firm, his eyes as resolute as steel. "I'm not lying," James replied, his voice stronger than ever. He locked eyes with Victor, his dark gaze unwavering, with no trace of fear. "If you don't believe me, call an expert to check." The entire cafe fell into an intense, suffocating silence. Everyone watched the unfolding drama. Curious and skeptical glances intermingled. Some patrons even started pulling out their phones to record the scene, not because they wanted to help, but because they couldn't take their eyes off this strange spectacle. But Jessica, now losing her composure, clenched her fists, her eyes flashing with fury. "What are you doing here?" Jessica screamed, her voice breaking like a play that was about to collapse. "Don't you dare make up this story." At this moment, the truth seemed so close. Each word from Jessica grew more desperate, less composed. The fear was starting to show on her once beautiful face. As she realized that her words no longer held any weight, Victor no longer looked at Jessica. His gaze returned to James, and though he was a man of wealth and power, His eyes were now filled with doubt. "Jessica, tell me, what did you put in that soup?" Victor asked, his voice dropping into a commanding tone. His question was no longer about doubting James, but about doubting Jessica. Victor's suspicion began to spread, and Jessica, despite her best efforts to maintain her cold demeanor, couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "What?" Jessica stammered, trying to remain calm, but her voice lacked the sharpness it once had. "It's nothing. Just a misunderstanding." But those words couldn't cover up the truth anymore. All eyes in the cafe turned toward her. Whispers began to fill the tense air. People could feel the oddness of Jessica's actions, and that was when the truth began to surface. Victor sat frozen, his hand still gripping the spoon, but unable to bring it to his mouth. Everything around him now was drowned in silence. The entire cafe, the patrons, and the staff were motionless. The only sound was the rhythmic breathing of those witnessing this strange ordeal. "Victor, don't listen to him. He's just a street kid with nothing to lose," Jessica continued, but her voice had weakened, as if she were trying to create a false shield over the truth. But Victor no longer doubted. His calmness had shattered, replaced by a growing anxiety. He looked down at the soup, his gaze full of contemplation, then back to James. "Are you sure about what you're saying?" Victor asked, his voice now more serious than ever. James did not step back. He answered firmly, "I'm sure. I saw it clearly." And he didn't blink, didn't hesitate. "If you don't believe me, get it tested. See what that liquid is." A profound shift happened in Victor's eyes, from indifference to something far more serious. He was beginning to feel something was terribly wrong. And then, as if a veil of secrecy had been lifted, he looked back at Jessica, his eyes filled with suspicion. "What do you want me to do? What are you planning for me?" Victor asked, his voice cracking, as if he were beginning to see a truth he had never wanted to confront. His questions started tumbling out like a flood. Jessica took a step back, her face no longer the picture of a graceful wife, but that of someone standing on the edge of a precipice. She felt the ground beneath her feet begin to crumble. "She wants me dead, Victor. She poisoned me," James said, his eyes never leaving Jessica, unwavering and fearless. His words struck Victor like a knife to the heart, cutting through the facade that had surrounded him. The atmosphere in the cafe had completely changed by this point. Whispers grew louder, and every eye in the room followed Jessica and Victor's every move. Everything seemed to be descending into chaos. But James stood firm, unflinching. He knew he had done the right thing. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest. But he was not afraid. He locked eyes with Victor again, waiting for his next move. Victor, still seated, no longer held the detached air of a powerful man. He had seen the truth in James' eyes. Everything was clear now, too clear to ignore. He leaned back in his chair, still gripping the spoon, but his eyes had lost their sharpness. A heavy silence descended, as if time itself had stopped. Everyone in the cafe was still, eyes fixed on the three of them. The murmurs began to rise, and suspicion about Jessica mounted. Finally, Victor could wait no longer. He turned to a nearby waiter, his voice stern. "Call the police." Victor's command was like a thunderclap, shattering the tense atmosphere. The waiter looked at him in shock before hurrying out to carry out the order. Jessica, by now, had lost all her composure. She shot up from her seat, her face twisted with tension, as though it might crack at any moment. "Don't do this, Victor," she shouted, but the command in her voice was gone. She began scanning the room, searching for an escape. But there was no way out for her now. James never took his eyes off Jessica. He knew the truth was beginning to unravel. And Jessica, the wife Victor had trusted for so long, was now being exposed. He stood there unyielding, though he didn't know what would happen next. But he couldn't stop thinking about what he had done. He had saved a life. The police arrived in a flash. Patrol cars screeched to a halt right outside the cafe. Two officers entered, sharply dressed, with a commanding presence. They surveyed the room before walking straight to Victor and Jessica's table. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Victor stood up, no longer the powerful man he once was. His face was now full of worry. "They're saying my wife poisoned me. I think she did it." The officer's gaze shifted to Jessica. She stood there, her hands trembling as she gripped her purse, trying to appear composed, but the panic was evident on her face. The officers moved toward her and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Jessica couldn't maintain her cold demeanor anymore. Her mind was spinning. All the preparation, all the lies, none of it worked anymore. She had reached the end of the line. She looked up at Victor one last time, but there was no longer any pride in her eyes. Only fear and desperation remained. Finally, in a fit of madness, she confessed, I did it. I couldn't take it anymore. He's been oppressing me. I couldn't live under his shadow. He wasn't supposed to live past this year." Jessica's words hit everyone like a shockwave. The patrons in the cafe couldn't believe what they had just heard. A life built on lies and ambition was now collapsing in an instant. The police quickly stepped forward and placed their hands on Jessica's arm. "You're under arrest for poisoning," one of the officers said, his tone firm. Jessica had no strength to resist. As the officer's hand reached out, she could only lower her head in silence. The cuffs were slapped on her, and she was led out of the cafe, leaving behind a heavy silence. No one seemed able to process what had just transpired. Victor sank back into his chair, his eyes empty. He said nothing, only staring at James. The once powerful man, who had stood at the pinnacle of wealth and influence, now felt like everything had crumbled beneath his feet. He had lost it all. A long while passed, and the atmosphere in the cafe slowly calmed down. The initial murmurs had faded into silence. People returned to their own lives, but the events that had unfolded lingered in their minds. James, the homeless boy, was the only one unmoved by everything. He stood firm, his gaze still fixed on the empty chair where Victor had been sitting. "James?" Victor called to him, his voice softer than ever. The boy didn't know what to do. His life had been without a place to call home for so long, and now he had the attention of this wealthy man. "You saved me," Victor continued, his tone filled with gratitude. "You saved my life, and I can't forget that." James was unsure of how to respond, but a warm feeling began to rise in his chest. For the first time, he felt like he mattered. Victor smiled and added, "I will help you. You don't have to worry anymore. You can have a different future." And just like that, as if by magic, James's life began to change. He hadn't just saved someone's life, he had brought hope to his own. In the stillness of the cafe, a great lesson had been learned. Sometimes, a single brave action, a quiet voice, can change a life. The police had taken Jessica away, but the tension in the cafe still lingered. Whispers filled the air, and all eyes remained fixed on Victor and James, as if the story wasn't over yet. Victor sat there, his hands still resting on the table, but his eyes were hollow, as though he had just experienced a nightmare that he couldn't believe was real. His world, the wealth, power, and perfection he had once prided himself on, had shattered in a matter of minutes. James stood there unsure of what to do next. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was just a child with rare courage who had dared to stand up for the truth. He felt an odd sense of relief, but there was also a lingering unease. How would his life change from here on out? Was this just a fleeting moment in his life, or would it mark a turning point? Finally, Victor spoke, his voice gentler than ever. "James, you saved me," His eyes were filled with gratitude. "You did something no one else could do, and I can't forget that." James was taken aback, unsure of how to respond. But Victor continued, his voice sincere. "You don't have to live like this anymore. You can have a different future." For the first time in his life, James felt something he had never imagined. Hope. This story wasn't just about saving a life. It was about courage in an unfair world. It was a lesson that sometimes a small act can change a life. And if you're hearing this story, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know what you think about James' actions. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can share more stories about courage, change, and hope. Thank you for watching, and don't miss the next video.